what I want to talk about this morning. Where do we go from here? How do you handle life when it appears that you have been picked out to be picked on? Some of us are highly familiar with what it is to be mistreated by people who don't even know you. One of the greatest preachers that I have ever heard of yesteryear was Pastor Leo Daniels. He is one of the few preachers who decades ago would have his sermons recorded on albums and circulated throughout the country. He was very popular in his hometown. He was a very tall man, a very dark-skinned man, and he was in the barbershop one day, and a fellow came in and announced to the barbershop that he had a question. His question was, what do you all think about that Leo Daniels? He said, I've heard that Leo Daniels is a low-down scoundrel. And he didn't recognize that Pastor Daniels was sitting in the barbershop. He said, yes, I've heard that he's a low-down scoundrel, that he's no good and he's not to be trusted. So the barber said to him, sir, have you ever met Leo Daniels? He said, oh, yes, I've met him many times. He said, well, what does he look like? He said, he's a short, light-skinned fellow. He was talking about Leo Daniels, but didn't know Leo Daniels. And some of us know what it's like to be picked out, to be picked on. You're not bothering anybody. You're not getting in anybody's business. You're just trying to live the life that God has given you to live and to lead. Yet your name keeps popping up in other people's conversations. That there are people who stand on the outside of your life giving commentary on your life as if they were inside of your life. And sometimes you wonder, why is everybody always picking on me? I got good news for you. And it is not just the fact that I saved a whole lot of money on my car insurance by switching to Geico. But I got some good news for you. If you have been picked out to be picked on, it automatically signifies that God intends to use you in a great and mighty way. Which means if you have a Goliath in front of you, it automatically means that there must be some David inside of you. Somebody is wondering, why do I keep facing all of these giants? It may be so that the Lord can allow you to use your slingshot. And because God intended to use the nation of Israel to give birth to the Messiah by the time you get to the Gospel of Matthew, because of what their destiny was, they endured persecution in Exodus chapter 1. They were picked out to be picked on. This is a great country that we live in, but it is not a country without faults and failures. And perhaps the greatest failure in the history of our country, even before the signing of its Declaration of Independence, the ratification of its Constitution, its Bill of Rights, or the remaining amendments to the Constitution, long before any of those things took place, perhaps the greatest blight on this country's history was the importing and enslavement of Africans. A second blight that faces our country are systems that were put in place and continue to exist to this day that oppress this country's darker citizens. The question then becomes, how do you take the world's lemons and make God's lemonade? There's several things right from the surface that I want to share with you that are birthed out of understanding not only this country's history with its darker citizens, but also how the framing of this country finds its basis in the Word of God. Here's the first thing that I believe that every believer ought to know. Goodness truly does exist. Goodness truly does exist. There's some good people in the world. Amen? Hopefully some of them in here. Some good people. Some of y'all saying to dwell above with the saints in love would be glory. But to dwell below with the saints I know is a different story. The truth is, there really are some good people. I love reading the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. And it is there that you discover that God took his people in Genesis, beginning in Genesis chapter 37, and moved them to a place called Egypt, where he incubated them for centuries to allow them to grow and to develop. He used a young man named Joseph who started off with a rocky start, but God used Joseph to deliver his entire family and to ultimately bring a sense of deliverance to the entire world. All of that occurs in Genesis 37 through Genesis chapter 50. Were it not for the contributions of Joseph, most of the people in the known world at that time would have died as a result of severe famine. But God used Joseph to accurately predict that there would be 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. And Joseph was used to manage things during that 14-year period. The Pharaoh of Egypt embraced Joseph, gave him the second highest position in all of Egypt. I want you to recognize that there truly do exist some good people. Goodness truly does exist. But that's not all I think you need to recognize. You should also understand that evil equally exists. You need to know that now. Which means you should not look at life through pessimistic lenses. Neither should you look at life through rose-colored lenses. It's some low-down people in this world. You don't believe it, just go home, turn on the news. Some of you don't have to go that far. You can look at your contact list in your phone and find some low-down people. Some of you can go to the family reunion and find some low-down people. Uncle Fred still owe you $175. Talking about he waiting on his income tax check. That was 5 years ago. You done got a whole lot of checks since then. Evil equally exists. Here's a parallel that we're given here in Exodus chapter 1. Look at verse 1 through verse 5. Now these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. They came each one with his household. These are the 12 sons of Jacob who were brought to Egypt with Joseph's help. They're named in verse 2. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. All the persons who came from the loins of Jacob were 70 in number, but Joseph was already in Egypt. That means when God brought them into Egypt, there were only 70 of them. But watch what you discover beginning in verse 6 down through verse 11. Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. But the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly and multiplied and became exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them. They started off as 70, and over time, by the time you get to around Exodus chapter 12 and Exodus chapter 13, there were 600,000 men, which means there could have been as many as 2.5 million people. Started off as 70 and turned into 2.5 million. God blessed them mightily. But watch the evil that starts in verse 8. Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. This is an interesting verse. Do not assume that this king came into power immediately. Hundreds of years have passed since the contributions of Joseph until this new king comes on the scene. I'm getting ahead of myself, but at somewhere in Egypt's history, someone stopped telling the story of how they got to where they were. My mom and I were talking last night. I reminded her of a story that she had shared with me almost exactly 5 years ago to this day. My parents grew up in a very small town called Harris Neck, Georgia. And in Harris Neck, they only had 2 stores. One store was operated by a man who was my dad's biological cousin. His name was Mr. Eddie Thorpe. And then a second store opened that was not far from the first store. My mom was sent to the store by her mother, but she was not sent to the first store. She was sent to the second store, because at the first store they sold bologna, but at the second store they had country ham. The first store had mystery meat, but the second store had finely diced country ham. And my grandmother didn't want mystery meat. She wanted country ham. So she sent my mother as a child to the store to purchase the ham. What my mother remembers is, as she was walking to the store owner of the first store was standing in the doorway and watched her pass by and go to the second store, watched her make a purchase and come out with a wrapped package. As she was passing by the first store for the second time, remember, she walked by him on her way to the second store. And as she was coming back on her way home, Eddie Lee Thorpe, my dad's cousin, was still standing in the doorway. And he said to my mother, "Eloise, go home and tell your mama not to forget the bridge that brought her over." What he was saying was, when there was no second store, he used to be the only store. And what he wanted my grandmother to remember is, don't forget the one who brought you to where you are and replace him with country ham. Somehow, this new king over Egypt did not get the memo that were it not for Joseph and Joseph's family line, Egypt would not have existed in the form that it existed in. Let me just throw this at you parenthetically in case you hear it somewhere. Don't let anyone ever tell you that if you don't like this country, you should go to another country. You can't tell me that historically, because were it not for my ancestral heritage, this country would not exist the way that it exists today. Watch what occurs in the text in verse 8. Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And here's what he says, beginning in verse 9. He said to his people, behold, the people of the sons of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal wisely with them, or else they will multiply in the event of war. They will also join themselves to those who hate us and fight against us and depart from the land. So they appointed taskmasters over them to afflict them with hard labor. And they built for Pharaoh storage cities, Pithom and Ramses. Hey, God's people weren't bothering anybody, but the Egyptian king suffered from a bad case of intimidation, which moved him to a bad case of exploitation. See, when people get intimidated by you, when they can't have what you have, their first desire is to use what you have, and their second desire is to destroy who you are. Be careful who you hang with. It's some people on your job. You will find this hard to believe. There's some people on your job. They don't have a problem with you as long as you and them are on the same level. But wait until you apply for a promotion in the same department. Wait till you move from being a subordinate or a lateral employee to a position of leadership. Some of the same folks who used to eat lunch with you won't want to eat lunch with you no more. He suffered from intimidation, which moved him to exploitation, which led him to the place of destruction. What had God's people done wrong? Not a single solitary thing. They were just picked out to be picked on. And I think every one of us in here ought to recognize that goodness truly does exist, but evil equally exists. Here's the last thing I want you to see by way of introduction, and it is this: God is bigger than both good and evil. Which means it doesn't matter how hard the world seeks to oppress you, there is a God who has the power to elevate you. Look at all that oppression that you find in verse 8 down through verse 11, but look at verse 12. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread out, so that they were in dread of the sons of Israel. The harder they were pressed down, the higher they rose to the surface. Because we serve a God who is bigger than human good, and he is bigger than human evil. If you don't learn anything else this morning, recognize that all of your trust ought to be in the Lord. Well, Pastor, when you find yourself in a place that you have been picked out to be picked on, you haven't done anything to harm anybody, the Lord is just blessing you, he's just adding to you, yet and still, it appears that all the enemies of the universe have been unleashed in your direction. The only question that remains is, where do we go from here? Now, if you would pause long enough to understand conditions even in our country, you will discover that if you pay close attention to those conditions, while many would agree that America is a wonderful country in a wonderful place, there are others who would admit that America is in a place of difficulty. Can I push it a step further? Gainesville is in a place of difficulty, where you have under-enrolled schools on the east side, over-enrolled schools on the west side, schools on the east side in disrepair, and new schools being built on the west side. Okay, that doesn't bother you. You don't have kids in school. Okay, that doesn't bother you. Oh, okay. All right. Multiple movie theaters on the west side. Not one movie theater on the east side. Multiple places to shop and spend money on the west side. Declining places to spend money on the east side. Okay, that doesn't bother you because you don't like shopping. Okay, multiple emergency rooms and hospitals on the west side, zero emergency medical facilities on the east side. A couple of years ago, I called my dear friend Matt Surrency, who is the mayor of the city of Hawthorne. I was just wrestling one day in my mind, and I said to him, Mayor Surrency, if someone has a heart attack or a stroke in Hawthorne, which is a part of Alachua County, I said, where is the nearest facility for them to receive emergency medical care? And his response was, Shands. I said, which one? He said, the one down there near the University of Florida. I said, you mean to tell me that if someone is having a life-threatening emergency in the eastern portion of the county, the nearest facility for them to get emergency medical care means they've got to drive all the way through the east side, all the way to Midtown, in order to get emergency medical treatment? And then I thought about my own neighborhood across the street from Kannapahaw Middle School. I can literally walk to nearly 5 emergency medical facilities, all within walking distance of where I live. My position to you today is not to get you to be pessimistic. It is also my desire to pull away your rose-colored glasses and to recognize if you keep doing what you've always done, you'll continue to get what you've always gotten. Where do we go from here? I'm so glad you asked, because the language of this glorious book proves to us in no uncertain terms where we are to go from here. Let me give you three, and I'm done. Here's the first one. If we're going to come out of what we find ourselves in, we've got to rely on some divine intervention. We've got to rely on some divine intervention. The question is not whether or not people should pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. That's hard to do when you ain't got boots or straps. Sometimes your situation can be so bad, with the deck stacked so far against you, until your situation requires some divine intervention. Hey, here Israel was, 2.5 million people in a strange land, and all of a sudden those who had treated them with hospitality become angry with them and intimidated by them. When you that big, surrounded by people who have made themselves your enemy, you need some divine intervention. Look at what you find beginning in verse 13 of Exodus chapter 1. The Bible says the Egyptians compelled the sons of Israel to labor rigorously, and they made their lives bitter with hard labor in mortar and bricks and all kinds of labor in the field, all their labors which they rigorously imposed on them. Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah, and the other was named Pua. And he said, when you are helping the Hebrew women to give birth and see them upon the birth stool, if it is a son, then you shall put him to death. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt had commanded them, but let the boys live. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing and let the boys live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not as Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife can get to them. So God was good to the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very mighty. Because the midwives feared God, he established households for them. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son who is born you are to cast into the Nile, and every daughter you are to keep alive. Never read the Bible too fast, because you miss more than you catch. Why didn't he just kill the Hebrew boys and the Hebrew girls? He only wanted to kill the boys, and specifically wanted to keep the girls alive, because his conclusion was, if you keep the girls alive long enough as they intermarry with Egyptians, because if you take away all the Hebrew boys, won't be nothing left but Egyptian boys. And before long, what used to be Hebrew will become all Egyptian. He said, take the boys, throw them all into the Nile River. Watch chapter 2. Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a daughter of Levi. The woman conceived and bore a son. When she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months, because remember, a decree had been given that all Hebrew boys were to be put to death. Verse 3, but when she could hide him no longer, she got him a wicker basket and covered it with tar and pitch. Then she put the child into it and set it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to find out what would happen to him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the Nile with her maidens walking alongside the Nile. And she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid, and she brought it to her. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the boy was crying. And she had pity on him and said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you? Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go ahead. So the girl went and called the child's mother. I wish you could understand what you were reading. The Pharaoh said, every Hebrew boy that you find, drown it. His daughter goes down to the Nile River to bathe, and here comes a basket floating. She opens the basket, and inside is the very thing her daddy told the whole nation that they were to kill. A little girl was walking along with the basket. She didn't know that the little girl was the baby's brother. And the little girl said, you want me to find one of them Hebrew women to help you take care of this new baby? And she said, yes. In verse 8, go ahead. So the girl went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages. So the woman took the child and nursed him. The child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses and said, because I drew him out of the water. The very son that the enemy was trying to kill, God saved his life and made somebody else pay his mama to nurse her own child. What am I getting at? Sometimes you need some divine intervention. You need God to do something out of the ordinary, something supernatural to pull you to where you need to be. This does not excuse any oppressed people from taking a positive role in their own deliverance. But you got to be honest about the fact that sometimes your help does not come from within, it comes from on high. I'm trying to help somebody. Because I don't want you to spend the next 40, 50 years of your life trying to figure out what you have done wrong, when the reality is sometimes you've been picked out to be picked on, and God has made your problem so large so that you will recognize that you can't fix it by yourself. You need some divine intervention. So between Exodus chapter 2 and verse 11, all the way to Exodus chapter 11 and verse 10, God supernaturally intervened. The first thing he does for them is to give them a deliverer whose name was Moses. He allowed Moses to grow up his first 40 years in Pharaoh's house. Then Moses kills an Egyptian. He's on the run, And then he spends the next 40 years on the backside of the desert hiding from Pharaoh. When he is 80 years old, God shows up to him by setting a bush on fire. The bush just wouldn't burn up. Wish I had some Bible readers. And God speaks to him out of the bush as Moses goes over with his inquisitive mind to inspect the bush. God speaks to him from the bush and says, Momo, take your shoes off, because the ground that you are standing on is holy ground. And God says, Moses, I want you to go back to your granddaddy and tell him that I say, let my people go. And Moses throws up a number of different protests. Moses said, first of all, he said, look, Lord, I got a speaking problem. And the Lord reminded him that I'm the one who gave you the tongue in the first place. But seeing as how you are protesting, I'm going to send your brother Aaron with you. You are the prophet. I will allow him to be a mouthpiece. Then he said, look, Lord, even though Aaron is coming with me, when I get to the people, who shall I tell them has sent me? God says, well, Moses, as best as I can explain it, because I got so many names that I could use. Moses, just tell them that the I am has sent you. Beg your pardon? You're not going to use a proper name, Yahweh, Jehovah, Elohim. No. Tell them the I am has sent you. That means, Moses, whatever you need on your journey, I'm that. If you get thirsty and want water to drink, I'll be water in dry places. He was also revealing to him that I am the God who was. I am the God who forever will be. I just am. I don't have a beginning. I'll never have an ending. I just am. And I wonder this morning, who are you rolling with? Some of you are relying on what was or anticipating what will be, when the reality of your present circumstance requires an I am God. And God works through Moses in between chapter 2 and chapter 11 by delivering a series of plagues that grieved the people of Egypt. The first plague began by God taking all of the waters of Egypt and turning them into blood. All the waters. Not just the waters of the Nile, but their rivers, their streams. The water that they kept in the refrigerator in the old milk jug. Wherever they had water, God turned the water into blood. That was the first plague. The last plague in chapter 11 is when he pronounced that all of the firstborn of both human beings and animals in one night would all die. It took 10 different plagues for Pharaoh to finally agree to let God's people go. And I want you to recognize that some of the problems that you face in this life are so large until they will require divine intervention. Well, not only must you rely on divine intervention, but you've got to listen to divine instruction. Which means God's not going to do it all. There's some things that you are going to need to do. You got to learn how to follow instructions. And what some of us don't ever want to do is follow instructions. But if you're going to get to where the Lord is trying to get you to go, you got to be willing to follow some instructions. And when you get to Exodus chapter 12, verse 28 through verse 41, God instructed his people, I want you to take the blood of lambs and take that blood and sprinkle it on the side posts of your doors and the lintel, that's the piece that connected the top sections of the door. And when I send the death angel into Egypt, every household that is surrounded by the blood, the death angel will pass by. On September 11th, 2001, a woman was in her home. She was getting dressed for work, and as she was making her way to work, she was riding in a taxi cab. Suddenly, she developed a nosebleed. And because of her nosebleed, she said to the cab driver, turn the cab around, take me back home so that I can change clothes. While she was at home changing, CNN reported that 2 planes had flown into the World Trade Center, into one of the towers that she worked in. And she reflected on the fact that if I did not have an emergency on my way to work, I would have been in one of those towers when the plane struck the tower. And her testimony was, the only reason I'm here today is because I was covered by the blood. They had to follow divine instructions. God not only said to them, I want you to cover the doorposts with blood. He said, I want you to go to all of your Egyptian neighbors and ask them to borrow the most valuable things they have in their home. Gold, silver, precious metals. They asked their Egyptian neighbors to borrow them, and the Bible says that God gave them supernatural favor with the Egyptians, so that whatever they asked for, they gave it to them. And then when the death angel passed through that night and God delivered them, not only did they come out of Egypt, but they didn't come out empty-handed. All they needed to do was to follow instructions. Miraculously, by the time you read Exodus chapter 12, verse 42 through verse 51, and in Exodus chapter 13, God spends all of those verses telling the children of Israel, watch this, that when I bring you out, tell the story to your children and to all those that you come in contact with. One of the reasons our country is in the shape that it is in today is because we stopped telling the story. So that we have a culture now that doesn't know the Bible, never read the Constitution, doesn't know what the Bill of Rights is, doesn't understand anything about constitutional amendments 11 through 27. The Constitution is actually a very fascinating document. I recommend that when you go home, you pull it up. It's literally just a list of procedures on how the country is to govern itself. You would never look in the mirror and look down at yourself if you recognize that the mere fact that you are still alive is a miracle all by itself. Let me just give you one. There's so many I could give you. Several weeks ago, one of the members of our church encouraged me to watch a movie. It was a movie that I had purposely avoided because I didn't like the title. The title didn't make sense to me. The movie was entitled The Green Book. And I didn't watch the movie because the title didn't make no sense. Green Book. So at their request, I sat down and watched the movie without interruption and finally understood what the Green Book was. And then I went online and ordered a Green Book. And flipping through the Green Book, I found both the city I was born in and the city that I reside in. The Green Book was a publication originally published in the 40s, later republished in the 50s, that was a list of lodging places that people of color could go to because they were not welcome in national hotel chains. So I looked at Jacksonville, Florida, and I saw streets that I recognized, and you would see the names of individual people who had rooms in their houses who were willing to rent those rooms out so that as people of color traveled across the country, they would have somewhere to lodge. And here I am now as a Hilton Honors Reward member without fully recognizing that there was a day when people who looked like me could not stay anywhere they wanted to stay. And you say, well, Pastor, what was the big problem and all that? Let me just throw this in for free. Here's a major problem with how our country has operated in the past. Because some people say, well, Pastor, in places like Woolworth, you were able to buy a meal, you just couldn't sit at the counter and eat it. Here's the problem with that. If I'm paying the same money for the meal that you're paying for the meal, yet I don't get to walk in the same benefits, that is inherently a problem. Dr. Oz Guinness was born in China, reared in England. He is one of the world's most highly regarded scholars as it relates to social criticism, says that one of America's greatest problems is that she has not transmitted her story. He says America has a broken transmission. Think about that. That we're living in an age where we got over, we just forgot how we got over. And we got the nerve to talk about what matters and what doesn't matter without being able to identify how we got to where we are in the first place. Follow and listen to divine instruction and keep telling the story. I want to recommend that you research your story so that you know how to tell your story. Well, here's the last one, and I'm done because I've been off for 2 weeks. Here's the last one. Rely on some divine intervention. Listen to divine instructions. God says, borrow stuff from your neighbors, put the blood over the doorposts, and when the death angel comes by, I'll spare all of your firstborn, but I'll kill the firstborn in every household that's not covered by the blood. And once God delivered that plague, Pharaoh finally said to the Lord's people, go. Here's the last thing. After you rely on divine intervention, listen to divine instruction, here's the last thing. Watch God work. Hey, when you get to the place where you recognize you can't make it by yourself, God, I need your help. And Lord, whatever you say I'm supposed to do, that's what I'm going to do. Then all you need to do is watch God work. That takes you to Exodus chapter 14, verse 13 through verse 31. Somebody is wondering why the Lord is taking you the route that he's taking you. You watch other people and it appears that their situations change so fast, but it seems like yours is just taking so long. And sometimes the long way round is the safe way home. Somebody right now is frustrated. Your brother, your cousin, they already got a brand new house. They already riding in real nice cars, and you think they ballers and shot callers. You don't know nothing about what kind of payments they're making on this stuff. And you wondering why God is taking you the way that he's taking you. Sometimes the Lord takes you on a difficult path so that when you get to the destination, you're not tempted to take credit for it. Okay, because somebody else is saying, my degree did this. My family name did this. My work history did this. No, I want some experiences that dictate God did this. So by the time you get to Exodus chapter 14, beginning in verse 13, it is interesting that when God delivers them from Egypt, it's about 2.5 million of them. He doesn't send them on the shortest route to their next destination. He sends them by way of the Red Sea. And while they're on their way to the Red Sea, before you get to verse 13 of chapter 14, God deliberately hardened Pharaoh's heart so that the same people he delivered, he is now seeking to recapture. Here's verse 13. But Moses said to the people, do not fear. Stand by and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you have seen today, you will never see them again forever. The Lord will fight for you while you keep silent. Ooh, somebody need to learn that if you just hold your peace, the Lord will fight your battle. Verse 15, then the Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell all the sons of Israel to go forward. As for you, lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it. And the sons of Israel shall go through the midst of the sea on dry land. As for me, behold, I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them. And I will be honored through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. I say, beg your pardon? Lord, what you want me to do? He said, the same staff you've been using to perform all of those other miracles, Stretch it out one more time. And the waters of the Red Sea will divide